met Shawn Tully about, believe it or not, 30 years ago, when we both started out as newly minted on-air TV correspondents at CNBC. And Shawn did a fantastic job. He produced a lot of big stories, but after a year, he decided to go back to Fortune magazine, his great love, on the digital side. And with that, Shawn, I want to welcome you today. Thank you very much for taking your time to talk to us.
Thanks so much, Greg. It's not often that I get to be interviewed by somebody else. I was going to tell.
Well, I'll try to be kind.
Yeah. I was going to say that I went up to interview a very famous lawyer at his house in the country. Had to go through all these little winding roads on a Sunday, and we spent about 5 hours together. And he didn't ask me one word about myself the entire time, which was fine. He pontificated for 5 hours and didn't ask anything about me, but the stories were fabulous.
Oh, that's professional.
I didn't take it personally.
Well, look, but before we talk about your skills in writing cover stories, which are legendary, I want to talk a bit about your early years as a financial journalist. And as you know, you started out, you got a bachelor's in English, not very financy, at Princeton. Then you got an MBA at the University of Chicago. Then you got a master's in applied economics. I don't know what that is, but applied economics in France.
Yeah.
And then you came back and you freelanced for a while in the U.S. And then you got a big break when you started to co-author a book at Sports Illustrated, which was owned by Time Warner,
Right.
which also owned Fortune.
Right, yeah, and at that time, Time Incorporated, it wasn't even Time Warner. They had one media property then, which was HBO, which they started in-house. But other than that, it was the empire of great magazines. There was Time Magazine, Life was still going, People Magazine was a huge moneymaker, and Fortune, which had this second magazine that was started under Henry Luce. So it was just a fabulous place, very intellectually rich. Writers would go back and forth among the different magazines. So it was a wonderful place. But what happened was that I co-wrote a book about tennis with a famous coach, Doug McCurdy, and it was published by Sports Illustrated Books. So the editor worked at Sports Illustrated. So he said, and I'm a penniless freelancer at this point, right? Okay. So he said, there is this job opening at Fortune for a writer-reporter. So I thought, I'm going to have to go through interviews and try to get it. So in that process, I read a lot of Fortune stories, and I thought, hey, this is really what I want to do, because the stories were so long, and they had so much personality, and they were narratives, and they were 5,000 words long, and I thought, wow, if I could do this, I'd be a happy man, right? So I did get the job, but the job that I had was not as a writer, but it was in a position where if you moved up, you could be a writer. So
That was your reporter researcher
Yes.
position at that time.
Right.
Very common at Fortune.
So in those days, Fortune was a very rich place. We had an economics department. We were on 3 floors. Everyone wore suits. And my job was to follow big-time writers around to their interviews, take notes. Very few people recorded in those days in longhand, and then type up the notes on an IBM Selectric typewriter, which had this revolving ball.
Stop for a second. Raise your hand if you know what an IBM Selectric is. Okay, good. That's not very good. Okay.
And then you had to white out all this stuff if you if you made mistakes, right? So that was my job. And the good thing about the job was that I was able to do something that no young reporter today can do, which is I got to follow around great writers. And I specifically worked with 2. One was the great Carol Loomis, who is now in her 90s, but when I was working with her, she would talk about Warren Buffett. I never heard of Warren Buffett, and they were best friends. And Carol, for 40 or 45 years, edited his annual letter every year. His last annual meeting, they had he called her out on, they had a big ovation for her. She was a legend in the business. And Carol Loomis was very tough, and she was really into numbers. She knew accounting cold. She read annual reports. She read proxies. In those days, it was very difficult to get all that information. You had to call down to Wall Street. We had a Fortune room that had annual reports, but it was hard to get data. But she got all the data. Her room was piled with these reports, and she did these highly analytical stories about ITT, where she exposed accounting issues at ITT, all these types of stories, extremely sophisticated, right? So we went and did this story about a failed pulp mill in Quebec that killed the earnings at ITT.
ITT, was a conglomerate.
It was a very early conglomerate by Harold Janine, right? So I was able to see her and how she got information and worked, right? I remember we were watching a film that was made about this plant. It was a rayon plant. And I didn't even notice, but in the story, when I saw the first track, it says, shareholders may want to realize that this film, the Arnie film, began with and ended with the howling of a loon. And I thought, what a great detail that she just picked out for these interviews. So the second one I worked with was Roy Rowan. And Roy Rowan was the polar opposite of Carol Loomis. He was an adventurer. He had covered the war in Vietnam for Time. He had worked in China before the fall of Chiang Kai-shek. He didn't care. He didn't know a balance sheet from an income statement. And he could care less, right? But he knew color, and he knew sexy stories. And he saw that the Hunt brothers were going bust on the silver crisis in Texas, and grabbed me, and we got out of Texas, right? So we spent a whole weekend with the Hunt brothers. Bunker's this big mountainous guy, the son of then the richest man in the world, probably H.L. Hunt. And Bunker's drinking Coca-Cola out of a quart bottle. Shawn, you wouldn't be an Irishman, would you? Talking about how he got back from Paris, and when I paid my bill at the Ritz, I thought I bought the place. He was like that. And I having these experiences, I think, this is what I want to do, right? It was so much fun. But then I started thinking, I'll never be as good as Roy Rowan, and I'll never probably be as good as Carol Loomis, but I can take their two strengths, and maybe if I can combine them, I can be good, right? So I tried to take the analytical part and combine it with the color part and make that into a career, and then do both almost pure profiles and color stories, do pure analytical stories, and then do mixtures of the two that, as we talked about, can make some great.
We'll talk about how they're shown in your covers. And by the way, a few years after he joined Fortune, he was Paris bureau chief for Fortune, living a nice, elegant life in Paris for 8 years, right? That was nice. Let's talk about how you report and write covers, the nub of our panel. Right. You've written more than 40 cover stories, dozens more long-form stories that weren't covers, ranging from 3,500 to 5,000 words, close to 3,500 on average, on Boeing, on Carl Icahn, on Donald Trump, on Jamie Dimon, on General Electric, and on and on. The key question I want to ask really is that, when you're looking at a cover, what are the key ingredients that make a cover, from your point of view, in terms of topic? I know you got 4 or 5 different categories.
Yeah, there are the corporate saga story, which I just did a cover story about Delta, right? I did one recently about Carrier, the HVAC company no one paid any attention to, had the greatest returns of any industrial company in America, led by a guy nobody knew about named Dave Gitlin. And there are 2 types of corporate saga stories. One is the pity of it, and the other is the glory of it, and there's really nothing in between. And if you get stuck with one in between, you can't make it into a good story. And then there are those negative, the pity of it stories. For example, Boeing, where I did a story that won the Sabre Award.
2024 Boeing story,
Yeah.
talking about their 3 decades of decline.
Right, yes. And that was called How Boeing Broke Down. And that was kind of an analysis of how the company got taken over by the non-engineering crowd who were financial engineers, bought back a lot of stocks, cut R&D, moved from an engineering culture to much more of a financial engineering culture. And then that resulted in all of the accidents and negatives that we were seeing now. So there are those 2 types of corporate saga stories.
You mentioned the mega profiles as well.
Yeah, mega profiles, that's basically where the corporate strategy is important, but the person's even more important. And that could be Carl Icahn, who I've written several stories about, who's an outrageous character who loves to put on a show, very charming, funny, hilarious. I would never want to work for him, but in person, he's telling me, I said, they ever made a mini series out of the dollar store wars. I asked him who would want to play him. Yeah, no one could play me. I said, Carl, hey, let's imagine some of the great matinee idols of the past. It's maybe Gregory Peck in his prime. I told Nelson Peltz, he said, I'm surprised he didn't say Cary Grant. That's what he's like, right? Yeah, he was a colorful.
You got Jamie Dimon as well. You did a lot on Jamie, did several covers on Jamie Dimon.
Yes, and I did the first one called The Contender when he was in the wilderness, when he had gone off to Bank One after, I guess, about a year after being fired by Sandy Weill, which was a very troubled.
Citigroup. He got fired
Yes.
from Citigroup and went to the Weill. Okay.
Right, a very troubled Midwestern bank. A lot of his team quit their big-time jobs at Citigroup and other big banks and went and joined him, just like that. And many of them ended up back with him at JP Morgan. And of course, it was the rise of Bank One and the purchase of Bank One to JP Morgan that put him in the top spot at JP Morgan.
Let's talk about, we'll talk about also the kind of story that seems a little bit more dull, maybe we might call it a Loomisonian, Carol Loomis kind story. In other words, measurement tool. You've got the Henrys, and then you've got the Griselda story at Coke. But talk about the Henrys first, which is a term that he defined, which is now used a lot. But you did a cover on the Henrys. What is that?
Henrys is an acronym that I invented that got into the financial vernacular that stands for high earners not rich yet. And it defines an entire demographic. And the demographic it defines are usually couples who are both high earners, a doctor and a lawyer, say, or could be a computer programmer and whatever. They have incomes, when I did it, maybe 350 to 500,000. Now it would have to be higher, quite a bit higher. And these people were being classified all the time as the rich, and they were constantly being targeted for tax increases. But rich is not the same thing as a high income. Rich is your net worth, not your income. Right? They're affluent, they lived well, but they would never be rich when I was writing these stories. And in saying that, I got a lot of response because they were saying, hey, that's true. Because I got a really expensive house with a high mortgage, and we got 3 kids, we want them they're in prep schools, maybe, but if they're not in prep schools, we want to save for them to go to private colleges, which had become unbelievably expensive, of course. And they had very high tax rates. There was nothing they could hide. They had no tax shelters, and they really didn't have a lot of savings. Now, interestingly, I haven't done that story for a while, but if I updated it, that situation might have changed because of the gigantic increases in both home prices and in their 401ks until this meltdown. But even so, they're probably a lot better off than when I first did those stories.
Yeah, you can find that in Wikipedia or whatever the definition.
Yeah.
But you also mentioned the other measurement, because you think this is a rather analytical story. Another angle that it doesn't look like as colorful. It's the former CEO of Coke using a very specific measurement tool to make the company successful.
Yeah, so Roberto Goizueta, who was a Cuban-born chemical engineering graduate, CEO of Coca-Cola, who really got the stock price rolling, loved this idea called economic value added. And so I did this cover story. It's the wonkiest cover story in Fortune history. It used to get mocked by some of the other writers who thought we should be doing more fun stuff, right? However, one good thing about the story was that Roberto Goizueta, who never gave interviews, said, come down to Atlanta and talk to me. So he was very charming in a double-breasted suit. He was drinking espresso out of these little Coca-Cola, paper Coca-Cola cups. I think he had Parkinson's. He shook, like, call me Roberto. He was very charming. And he talked about he had piles of annual reports. He would sit at home. I think he had a big pillow that said, he had printed excess returns darned into his pillow or whatever. And he would read these annual reports, and he could figure out which companies were adding capital, and for each dollar of capital they added, the marginal capital, not the total, how much are they making, right? So if they're adding, the way that I won't go into the way EVA works, but basically it's your debt plus your equity, your capital underlying the company. So if the debt plus equity is going up by $1 billion a year, and you're making 300 million on the additional billion, he's going to buy your stock, right? He thinks that's a model of great management, and that's the reason for they spun off the bottling companies to bring down the capital costs and just sold the syrup to these bottling companies and kept their capital costs way down while their earnings are going up very fast. So they're literally shrinking the capital base while the earnings are going up. So Coca-Cola stock went crazy. Now they've reversed that process in recent years. But that whole idea, which was sponsored by a company called Stern Stewart, they invented it, became very influential. So that was one of the stories that had virtually no personalities except for Roberto Goizueta.
I was going to say, because also a wonky topic, because Goizueta is a very colorful guy.
He is.
So that's the difference.
That's right. So I was able to get at least one colorful guy into the story.
I want to ask you another aspect regarding covers. This goes for you guys more than maybe in our era, is that readers have shorter and shorter attention spans today. They're oftentimes looking at a cover story or even a 900-word story or 600 on their cell phone, and they're getting off the subway. I do that, right? Or off a train or whatever. And the really a question is that, how do you structure a cover or a long-term story to make sure a reader starts the 3,500 words and gets all the way through it? What technique do you use?
I don't know. That's a really good question.
You told me earlier, I'll read it if you told me to.
Please.
You said it said it has to be lots of tension, it has to be anecdotal, and I ought to steal this for a book that I ought to publish, and I'll give myself credit for it, but you said it. You say that the reader is willing to swallow lots of analysis if you put in a lot of color.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Back to your point about how do you get them to read all the way through it, right? For example, someone like Ed Bastian is a very colorful
the CEO of Delta.
Delta. He's a cheerleader. I followed him out to the Sphere in Las Vegas, where he hosted their 100th anniversary celebration. He's on stage. He's a showman. He's got Tom Brady popping up one minute. He's got Viola Davis popping up the next minute. He is like an Oscars host, right? Then a week or two later, I go to Atlanta, and he's hosting their annual profit sharing day, where it's like a big Mardi Gras, and he's high-fiving everybody. He's standing in line for selfies, and he'll stand there forever until he goes through all the people who load the planes, or the people in the cargo rooms, or in the call centers. So he's great with people, and he's a lot of fun to write about. But at the same time, Bastian had a really interesting corporate strategy, which was when everybody thought that the successful airline was all about cost cutting and low prices, he decided it was all about premium service. And they invested usually in everything from first class, which was the giveaway when he first started this, which cost 10 times what Coach, and he brought those prices way down and filled up the first class seats. He was a pioneer in the lounges, spending a lot on these luxury lounges, on fixing up terminals in a big way. If you've seen the Delta terminal at LaGuardia, it's like a palace. And he did this, first to do this, he had to get service up much better, because Delta was always way behind and on time. So they fixed the operations first, and then they were able to charge more, and they became the most profitable airline, using a template and a model that everyone 10 years earlier thought was going to fail.
That's really a counter-trend, counterintuitive story, and it's, by the way, that's the most recent cover of Fortune that's out in the last month or so.
Yeah, I wanted to mention one that I did just before that, which was assigned by my editor. I never ever would have thought about this. Was a profile of the successor to Warren Buffett, whose name is Greg Abel, A-B-E-L. And I said, well, he's never going to talk to me. We'll do it anyway, right? So I had to go through this whole investigative thing where I had to look up every obscure tape of the annual meetings, and I had to go through just a couple of interviews that he had done with his college. And then I started calling around to his friends in Des Moines, where he comes from, and But miraculously, I was able to put together a pretty detailed profile of him. And thank God, I'd call his friends who were coaching his son's hockey team, or they were neighbors of his, and names that I happened to find in the newspapers. And when I would call them back, or people that he had done deals with, one who had been with him when he did his first company, which was, he was an auditor in Canada, and they moved him for 6 months to San Francisco, and he was auditing this thermal energy company that was virtually bankrupt, that got taken over by Warren's friend Walter Scott, his buddy, and that's how he got into the network. And I called a director who lives in Westchester County, who was very young, he'd been very young at the time, who had been a director, and he knew all about Greg Abel and his skills coming up and his personality. And the good thing was, when I would call these people back, obviously the first call they made was, this guy from Fortune wants to know all about you. He clearly said, go ahead and talk to him. Because they all responded, they all checked facts with me, they all provided additional information. So even though I didn't speak to him, and we're all gonna, as journalists, you're all gonna be faced with this issue where you gotta do a story without any cooperation. So it worked.
Also, sometimes you actually end up getting the person's cooperation
Yes.
in the end. You say, I will talk to you because you talk to everybody else, and I want to give my say. But it's a great example of oftentimes having to write a story when the company completely shuts you down, says we're not talking.
Yeah, actually, I wrote to Buffett first. I emailed him. He had his assistant's email, and he wrote back. He was very gracious and said, I don't want to do an interview with Greg. I think the world of him, but all I do is play bridge these days, and one of these typical self-deprecating emails. But he knew I was on it, obviously, and that may have helped.
Also, by the way, you lace your stories when you read them. They have vivid description. It's almost like a novel that brings you right into the storyline, pulls you right in. But one of them, you're talking about Carrier,
Yeah.
which is a really dull company, but it had better performance than most tech stocks. But the CEO, you tell there how he met his wife at Cornell. You had a guy with a remove. What was that anecdote?
Yeah, well, just to back up about Gitlin, I got interested in him because I was doing the Boeing story, and it turned out he was on the board of Boeing. And I'm thinking, and he had worked, believe it or not, he had worked very closely with the current CEO, who came out of nowhere. So clearly Gitlin was the one who brought him in, when the other guy was at a company that was purchased by United Technologies, so Rockwell Collins, because Gitlin had been the head of aerospace at Rockwell Collins. And then I look up that Carrier gave a $200 million signing bonus, or rather retention bonus, to Gitlin in January. No one noticed it. It was in an 8K filing. Thank you, Carol Loomis, right? So I see this and I'm thinking, he got offered the job at Boeing. And when I interviewed Gitlin, he pretty much winked at me and confirmed, right, that it was the case. Anyway, getting to your question. So I go down to Palm Gardens, Florida, where this headquarters looks like the back of a giant air conditioner, and with vents and everything, and the temperature changes depending on the amount of sun that's hitting it from minute to minute. Anyway, and Gitlin he's about 6'3", and comes down and he dismisses the PR guy and says, just come up to my office. And we talked for about 2 hours. And he had never been interviewed by a journalist at that point. But anyway, so then I spent more time with him in New York at lunch, the Carlisle Hotel. And then I asked, as I always do when I'm doing a profile, or even a story about any company that's not strictly a profile, I'd like to speak to a couple of friends of yours. And the PR guy gets back to me and said, how about his wife? So I'm thinking, this is too good to be true, right? So I talked to his wife, and I knew already that they had gone to Cornell together. And so I was wondering, how did you meet Dave? So she said, well, I'm 5'3", and Dave is really hefty, 6'2" or 3, and said that her sorority and his fraternity had a cocktail party. And so she's talking to one of his fraternity brothers, and lovely conversation. And all of a sudden, this big hulking football player fraternity brother of Dave's comes over, picks this guy up, swirls around, plants him 10 feet away, and Dave Gitlin swoops down, and they started dating and got married.
What,
So anyway, I have to credit his wife with knowing a good anecdote and being nice enough to tell them.
I just want to mention one vivid description that caught me. It's about 6 lines. It's from a 2018 cover story that Shawn wrote about billionaire Carl Icahn and his compadre billionaire, Darwin Deason. They're attacking
Oh my God.
Xerox, right?
Yeah.
Because they felt Xerox was being sold for a far too low price to another company. And Shawn's prose goes like this: the 6'4" icon who never lost his thick Queen's accent despite a Princeton education is a creature of Wall Street and the quintessential deal junkie. The compact Deason, for his part, who in both tenacity and appearance resembles a bulldog, is a business builder who grew up on a farm in Arkansas. With a combined age of 160 and combined Xerox holdings of 15%, they
That's
make
good.
a formidable duo. But I felt like you could see, those two, you could just see the story, right there, okay?
Yeah, Darwin Deason told me, I said, Darwin Deason. I said, is there any chance they named you Darwin after the survival of the fittest, right? Charles Darwin? He said, I don't know, he said, but he said, I ran my company like a treadmill and I'd ramp it up faster and faster. You got thrown off the back, too bad for you.
I want to ask you a last question, here on narrative, because you use narrative heavily and powerfully to tell many of your cover stories that take you right through as like a conveyor belt, like your cover story on Boeing, which takes you back 3 decades into their failures. Your 2024 cover on CEO Larry Culp,
Right.
GE,
Right.
on how he turned around GE, and then also the Icahn Deason story at Xerox. Do you want to expand at all on your narrative approach?
Well, it depends. Sometimes you have kind of an extended history to relate. Other times you've got the history of the CEO, of a career that you can go through, like I did with Dave Gitlin, describing how he got where he came from. I'm just doing one now on a big beverage company CEO that no one knows anything about. Fascinating career in the food business, and the way that he came up is really going to be a tale that I'm going to tell in this current story that I'm working on. But again, in all these cover stories, you really want to have some literary qualities. You want to have personality, you want to have anecdotes, you want to have drama, as you said, you want to have tension. But not all of them work out that way. As I said, I did a story about predicting the housing crash of 2006 and 7 with a picture of a house falling off a hill that was a cover. And I was 2 years in advance, but I did the analysis and I called it right. So it's, sometimes you can make great calls and it can be great for your career to do the analysis, and other times, it's all about the color.
Because you mentioned one very optimistic one you did earlier when you were in Paris about the outlook for the European common market, I believe it was, Europe, and basically you said in retrospect you were way too optimistic.
That's right. Yeah, I did a cover story called "The Coming Boom in Europe." Shame on me. And it was, but at the time, Kohl was in office, Thatcher was in office in the UK. And Europe had turned quite in a capitalist, deregulatory, lower tax direction, which seemed to bode well. And so I kind of thought that would continue, but I was wrong. Europe went the other way and never stopped going the other way. It was a naive story.
Let's talk about CEOs, making contacts with CEOs, because writing cover-worthy stories in the financial world depends not only on great writing, but great reporting and access to CEOs at a high level and at a high quality level, I would call it. You've excelled at developing strong relationship with Carl Icahn, Nelson Peltz, Larry Culp, Jamie Dimon a lot, and it goes on and on. How have you cultivated those relations where you really still call them up 5 years later or 10 years later for stories?
well, first of all, you got to get in the door, which is difficult. In the case of Diamond, there wasn't anybody chasing after him back when he went to Bank One, so that kind of got us to be friendly, and I was able then to write stories. He trusted me after that story, and I was able to then follow him to JP Morgan and write a lot more stories about him. In the case of Dave Gitlin, he'd never been written about. He was very, very reluctant to have anything written about him because you get this cliche all the time with CEOs. I only want to talk about my team, right? I don't want to have any attention paid to me. I don't want to prance around. I don't want to be a peacock, right? And I said to him, look, your team doesn't know enough about you, right? Your employees don't know your career and how you did at UTC and how successful you were. And I said, I can tell that story, and he basically agreed, finally. I'm trying to think of some of the other who I've...
How about Icon?
One of them.
Okay.
Yeah, Icon has not been returning my calls for about 2 years now, unfortunately, which I can't really figure out because he owes me big, frankly. One that was astounding was Hunter Harrison, the railroad magnate. And I got interested in him because he was the father of point-to-point railroading. And he completely turned around both Canadian Pacific and Canadian National Railroads, made him use it for Bill Ackman.
What is that? What is
made
it?
billions.
Describe point-to-point railroading.
Point-to-point railroading is the same theory in railroading that Southwest Airlines has in airlines. They don't use hubs. And the rest of the U.S. train industry is all hubs, right? So this partner of Ackman's who had left Ackman decides he's going to get Hunter Harrison. By this time, Hunter Harrison is 75 years old. And they are going to he's going to buy shares in CSX, one of the 2 or 3 biggest railroads in America. They're going to do it secretly. Then they're going to go to the board and say, you've got to name Hunter Harrison CEO or your stock's going to collapse. Because the stock was going crazy. No one knew what was going on, right? Because they're buying so many shares. Stock's up 30% or something, and no one can figure it out. So this partner of Ackman's, Paul Hilal, says, you got to, the board, you want the stock to go back down, you got to name Hunter Harrison, this genius, as CEO. The only problem was that Hunter Harrison was on an oxygen tank all day long. He was very ill, right? So the board could not get any medical exam for Hunter Harrison. But he did get named CEO. The stock goes up much more. And he goes right to work, completely changing the business model of CSX into a point-to-point model, which completely shook things up. He had to fire half the top executives there to do it. They'd never heard of this thing working. They didn't know how to do it, but he did. And so for about a year, they went great, right? He's transforming and he's getting his costs way, way down.
He gave you good access? I mean, what kind of access?
So I can't remember how I got to him, but he agreed to let me come down and interview him at his house it was in West Palm Beach, and it was on a golf course. He had big horse farms. He was a big horse guy. And he's on an oxygen tank. And he's telling me about growing up in Memphis and going to, he was buddies with Elvis's bodyguards, and they'd go to the theater, watch a movie, and Elvis would turn off the movie after about 20 minutes, and they have to put up another movie, and he had to be up in the gallery while Elvis and his bodyguards are down in front, his girlfriends are down in front. How he started off in a control tower at a rail yard, and that all he had was thermoses of coffee, packs of Tums, and no food, and his days that's how he learned the business, and then of course he became this reigning genius in the railroad industry. But this is one of the reasons why I didn't record that interview. Now I record everything. I agree, it's pretty old-fashioned not to record, right? I didn't record that interview, and
How many years ago was that?
It's about 3 years ago,
Okay.
4. I'm going through my notes, and I see this word I can't, and it happens when would take notes by hand. I would lose words, right? I'm looking at it, I gotta figure what this word is. And so I figured out what Hunter Harrison said was, I got all the respect in the world for Bill Ackman. But when his Harvardness, that was what the word I could not, comes oozing out of his pores, and he tells me how to run my railroad, I just say, "Shut up, Bill." But I almost lost that word. So my only advice is record everything.
One question I wanted to ask you was that, when you started out at Fortune several decades ago, there was a whole team of senior writers who did just long-form stories. They didn't do breaking stories, a lot of small stories. Now under the new Fortune is with all digital, you're expected to do a high volume of short stories during the day or during the week, and then long-form or cover stories.
Right.
And you had to adapt to that, while a lot of your colleagues did not. And you said that CNBC helped you, is the reason you were able to do that when you returned.
Yeah, but there were a couple of steps in my development. One was, before I went to Paris as the bureau chief in '83, I really only wrote kind of these long-form personality stories, kind of the corporate saga story. And then when I went to Paris, I had to do everything. I had to write about the François Mitterrand's right turn toward austerity when the French economy got in big trouble, every kind of story I had to do, which was very helpful. Then when I went to CNBC, it was a big step because, as you know, the logistics in television are really rough, right? You and I would do packages every day, meaning you have to do a pre-recorded piece that would air a couple times a day. And you had to get people on camera, so you didn't have time to go interview them yourself. So you'd send camera crews down to Wall Street, they'd bring back the tape, you'd log the tape, you had to then narrate it was a lot more logistic than reporting, unfortunately.
A lot more technology before you even get to the content you have to go through, which is much more difficult to manage.
But the stress compared to what I was doing as a writer was so intense, and the having to adjust your metabolism to that pace was so challenging, but I had to do it, right? And I did. But when I went back to Fortune after a year and almost a year and a half, no deadline ever bothered me again after what I went through, the race and the sprinting that I went through as a TV reporter. Everything else I had loads of time for, and it's still true.
Now, before I get to the Q&A in a minute, you wanted me to remind you about we were talking about the kind of discipline accounting that you recommended you should do before anything else if you're going to be a good financial journalist. Talk about that.
Yeah, accounting is the guts of a company, right? And if you understand it, you have a big edge or economics, it's similar. You don't have to take the word of experts. You can do your own analysis. And I do this all the time. I've been doing it just in the last few days about the tariff situation, for example. But I did it when I called the housing collapse, because I just did lots of kind of statistical analysis of how the prices were such a gigantic multiple of rents. It was like when the NASDAQ went to 100 times earnings, you knew it had to collapse, right? So if you can do that, but accounting, and Carol Loomis was, of course, really very insistent on learning accounting for journalists. If you don't understand it, and you don't have to be an expert, but to understand the basics of it. For example, person who was my research assistant for a while, Bethany McLean, figured out, mainly with help from analysts, or actually from accountants, that Enron, which was thriving and was supposed to be the solution to the energy business, that their book earnings, their GAAP earnings kept going up, but their cash flow kept going down. Something was wrong, and it was, right? And that made her a superstar. That made that call.
She's written several books, of course.
Several books.
Award-winning books.
Yeah. And that was pure analysis. And it was a very, very bold call. She got all kinds of resistance from Enron about it, but she was right, and it was all based on her knowledge of accounting, or her ability to understand it. I did the same thing when there were predictions by the guy who called the Madoff. Remember the accountant who said that Madoff was going to go down, and he said that Madoff is inventing these numbers. There's no way they can be real. And he was right. So now he predicted that GE was going to go down. And he teamed up with a hedge fund that shorted the stock, so they made a lot of money, because when he made that announcement, the stock did go down. So I decided to dive in and figure out, is GE really going to go down? And Culp was already there, but it was very troubled. And I decided no, that the accounting showed it wasn't going to go down. And it was fortunately, unlike calling the boom in Europe, that was correct.
So the key, learn accounting. But he did a great story in the past 5 days on analyzing Smoot-Hawley, the 1930s versus Trump's terrorists. It's a very harrowing analysis, but he did that crunching your own numbers.
Yeah.
And which shows it. We're going to have some Q&A now. Would anybody like to ask a question? Go ahead.
Hi, Sriram. I'm in the MA Business program at Columbia. Can you talk a bit about using color in your story, and when do you use it or not use it? One of the things that I get from sources and companies very often is whether the color I'm writing in the story is relevant to the story or sort of superfluous. I often feel that it does tell you something about a personality, but a lot of people feel like, is this something of a trade-off, or it shouldn't come across as gossip. Is that something you worry about? How do you sort of think about that?
I think a lot of color gives you an insight into the mindset of the CEO. What are they interested in? What are they kind of obsessed by in their personal lives? I know that they object. Look, companies don't like to portray themselves as colorful, period, right? But I find that I never try to undermine anybody personally. I never say anything that's negative about somebody personally, right? I don't do that. But unless they're in a scandal. Harvey Weinstein, I did this very long. By the way, that was a feature-length story that was online. So online gives you the opportunity also to do very long stories. That was beyond.
Because you've done some 8,000 word long form as well.
I think that probably was, yeah. But I find that I don't get a lot of pushback because the CEOs though are not as risk averse as the PR people, right? So when you talk to them, they'll tell you a lot of stuff. The guy that I'm writing about right now is very open about his background and his hobbies and everything else. So I don't think you burn any bridges that way, and I think you had a lot of. You're going to be able to lure and bring people into the story in a much better way.
Also, I think it depends on what kind of color you use, because you have to use your journalistic judgment in choosing color or description that tells you something about the person.
Understood.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
Do you have go-to questions when you're trying to probe for color? Do you have any questions you like to go to?
Well, I asked to speak to their friends, and usually they don't mind at all. I don't think I can think of a case where the CEO said no. And then I just ask her, where did you go to school? What their parents did is also, it's often very, very interesting. The person I'm writing about now would go to the office with his father on Sunday and was obsessed with the first kind of photocopying machine and would make drawings of it, and he was 7 years old, would question his father about the organizational structure of this huge company in the Midwest. And that stuff is relevant to the way that they think now. But no, usually it comes from the CEO themselves and from their friends as well.
Good.
Yes. Well, I gather that in interviewing all these CEOs, you also had to work with their publicists. So what advice would you offer about working with CEOs' publicists, and are there any interesting anecdotes about that you would share?
Yeah. PR people can be very, very helpful, and I think if you knock them, you're making a mistake. Because first of all, they're the first gateway into speaking to the CEO. So if you explain to them what you want to do, if send them what they want to see, questions, or know what you're interested in, I definitely provide that. And maybe because I've gotten older, they tend to think maybe I'm
Harmless?
harmless. Well, Greg, it's my age and my era of
You're
dignity.
definitely not harmless.
It's my age and my era of dignity that are my two greatest assets. Although, as you would know, I don't have the second.
But I can be fair, they're very different. I always used to put PR people in several different categories. in terms of how, some are not that helpful at all, some in the middle, and some can really open the door, and they almost have as much power, not as much power as the CEO, but they have great access to the company and give you an understanding even of how the CEO operates.
Well, for example, the story that I did about Boeing, I did several. I did the one about the exclusive about the whistleblower who killed himself in his truck, where I talked about it, the last days of the Boeing whistleblower. I did how Boeing broke down. I did one about the union, the big fight with the machinists union. And so I had to deal a lot with Boeing's PR people, especially one PR person, a woman, and was actually married to a very well-known writer in Seattle. And she fought back very hard on a lot of things that I was saying were the fault of they're taking away inspections. And this stuff got very technical. There were whistleblowers were claiming that they had seen certain practices, and she would fight back and say that's impossible. We went back and forth a lot on this stuff. But she saved me from making some mistakes. And I thought she was pretty fair, right? When the story came out about how Boeing broke down, she called me and she said, there was a lot in the story about how when they went to the 787 Dreamliner program, they completely changed their model and they outsourced almost everything, whereas they made everything in-house before that. And they lost a lot of control over the quality of the components that were coming in, and they had huge delays. It was very difficult. And she called me and she says, I didn't know a lot of that stuff. And she said she learned a lot from the story. Who knew, right? So I get along with her. I can call her. She can tell me things off the record. And so PR people can be extremely helpful. In fact, a lot of them are former journalists, and they're very funny, and they tell you good anecdotes too.
Anybody else? Oh, Jordan, I'm sorry, I didn't see you.
No, all good. So I want to ask two questions. So I know that like with CEOs, they like to tell a lot of the same stories. They get very practiced in like how they present themselves. So I'm curious, your research process, like how you kind of know what their stories are, and then two, how do you draw them out of those typical stories so you can get fresh stuff?
Yeah, business is the world of cliches and repetition, and a lot of what they say is completely worthless. Right? So how do you get past? However, what they know is not worthless, and their strategies aren't worthless, and they're always talking about how wonderful the employees are, and they're talking about how it's all about the customer, even though no matter how greedy they may be, it's always about the customer. So how do you break through that is a really good question. And one way is to know accounting and to be really financially sophisticated, and then you can ask them questions that will make them open up. If you need to be as interested in what they're doing as they are also. You got to show a lot of enthusiasm. You have to know their business really well so they respect you, and then you'll get more. And of course, analysts are not terribly helpful in helping you form the kind of questions that you need to challenge a CEO, but some of them are, especially the ones who are very negative. I would concentrate on those as opposed to the positives. And the negatives are in relatively short supply on Wall Street. But the ones who really know accounting, crunch some numbers, there are people who have done great numbers, for example, on Tesla, that I trust tremendously in challenging, but Tesla doesn't respond, but do much better numbers than the analysts who are constantly touting Tesla. So I think you have to be very, very well prepared. The more you know about their accounting and their business strategy, the better. If you can talk to some of their customers, for example, so you don't have to just talk to the analysts, that can be very helpful.
Jordan, you mentioned that the CEOs you work with have some kind of toucan responses.
Yeah.
What do you mean? Can you expand on that? That's interesting. So to help Shawn out as well.
Yeah, for sure. So I've been doing a lot of like CEO profiles as well. So obviously listening to all the interviews that they've done in the past, the podcasts they're on, and you just start hearing the same stories that I could even say in my sleep. So, and then there's twofolds. Like, I don't want to rewrite that story that he always like is his canned answer, but then that art of like, oh, being respectful, like, oh, that's a great anecdote. Tell me about this. I wanted to see if you had like good skill or tips on how to kind of respect what they're saying, but then.
Well, I don't know that, do they tell anecdotes on the conference calls and stuff? Because usually it's just a lot of
I think you
dry-
meant other interviews though.
One-on-one interviews.
Oh, one-on-one, yeah. Good. Well, if you're getting anecdotes out of them, so
But
they,
they're like,
they're repeating the
like
same
their
ones.
Favorite anecdotes, and it's like, you don't want to rewrite that in a profile, because that's their safe story, basically. So have you ever been in an instance where you feel like they're about to start a story that you know they've told other journalists? And then if so, how do you then get them to tell you a new type of story?
Well, I have the benefit of spending a lot of time with them typically. I don't repeat the stories that are already out there. And also, I'm lucky enough to be able to get the ones who've never talked before, like Gitlin, for example, or for example, Mark Rowan of Apollo, who I got to before he went public. And so I was able to talk about his career, which he had never really discussed before. So sometimes you really got to get to some of these less known figures to avoid that.
Yeah.
But the more you read up about their careers, and if you could talk to any friends of theirs, I would definitely ask to speak to friends. And they'll tell you things that that have not been repeated, that have not come out in the press.
You had another question, Jordan?
But by the way, Jordan, thank you so much for putting this together. It's priceless.
One thing. Okay. Anybody else question? Go ahead.
Related to your question, when you ask a CEO, like, could you name some friends that I could talk to? Who else do you think about talking to? Do you always make a point of talking to a former professor or teacher, or childhood friends beyond the friends that they refer you to? Who else are you looking to talk to?
Well, for example, in the case of doing that profile of Greg Abel, who wouldn't speak to me, I dug through annual reports, very old ones, and they had just been kind of photocopied and they were online, but they went back to this early thermal energy company, and I picked people from the board who were willing to speak to me. You find them on LinkedIn. So that's definitely, go back to the old deals that they did, right? What company did they sell? Where's that CEO now? Who was on their board who left, for example? Who was fired, who might be willing to speak to you on background or even for quotation? So there's lots of ways, and LinkedIn is a great way to find these people who you otherwise wouldn't be able to find phone numbers or emails for.
Please, I'll get you, Andrea, this lady here first.
I'm just wondering about what's your research timeline to target down to a specific CEO that you're looking for? Like how do you make sure that you are going to write about this person, not maybe your second choice?
Well, I usually just do one at a time. I'm not lucky enough to have 2 or 3 lined up. So that's not usually a problem.
That's why I think you usually use the general story, and then you go for the CEO as the head of the company. You know what I mean? It's not like you choose the CEO unless you're doing a specific profile. In other words, there's a breaking story, a big story about Boeing, but you're not thinking of the CEO initially. The CEO becomes a part of the larger story.
Well, for example, in a story like Boeing, you're never going to get to Calhoun, right? They just shut themselves off completely because of all the liability, and they really went secret completely. But for example, with Donald Trump, right? No problem. He was in the real estate business.
Andrea?
Yeah. Before you mentioned about contacting people on LinkedIn, former member of boards and other people related to the CEO. maybe you're enough persuasive to convince them to reply immediately, but when they do not reply immediately, what is your strategy to follow up, like to be persistent without being too much persistent, like without bothering them, annoying them, or stalking them?
Well, 2 times is the max. They're not gonna get back to you. Probably after the first time, they're not gonna get back if they don't respond. But if you write a relatively long message on LinkedIn or an email that shows that you have quite a bit of knowledge, and I always say that I'm a veteran writer. So they probably maybe they look me up and they see that I've been around a long time, right? So that may help. But I always write something that shows that I've done a lot of reporting and I know quite a bit. So it's not as if, I'm trying to write it well too, so I'm not as if you're gonna be my only source, right? That I'm already into this. And then I say I'll check back quotes with you, which puts a lot of people at ease. And I've almost never had to take anything back, believe it or not. So that gives a certain level of comfort as well.
And do you offer off the record possibility?
Off the record is worthless because you can't use what they say, right? Not for attribution means you can use it, but you can't attribute it to them, right? So you can quote someone anonymously, a big supplier to Boeing told me, a former airline CEO told me, right? And use it, and which is fine with them. But if it's off the record, you can't use it, which is and I never ask anyone to tell me anything that's off the record. Usually what they'll say is, well, this is off the record. I'll say, what you really mean is I can use it so it's not for attribution, because a lot of sources don't understand that difference. But you don't want to hear anything off the record. I don't think I do this, but you'll try to find a way to get it from somebody else, right? Which I probably would do anyway, but I hope I wouldn't do.
Okay, go ahead, then I'll get you.
It will give you a lead to get it from somebody else.
Go
So
ahead.
with the growth of meme stocks and the projection being kind of based on vibes, I think of Elon Musk and the 54 billion pay package, just kind of based on his personality and branding. Do you have an awareness or perhaps a fear on elevating these people in a way that's glamorized? Or do you kind of see your role as demystifying the exclusive nature of their personality?
Well, I've never interviewed Musk, but I've kind of demystified his numbers quite a few
You do
times.
some profiles on what tests, I think
Yeah,
you've done some analyses.
I've done a lot of
Testing.
analysis of him, and I think Tesla on the numbers is worth a fraction of what it's selling for. And I can't really figure out, every time stock goes down, he comes up with another big promise that boosts it back up, but the numbers get worse and worse and worse. I just did one based on the actual earnings of the car making part of the business, taking out the gains that he got from selling Bitcoin, which is obviously never going to recur, and then he gets a lot of credits for selling environmental credits to companies that are behind on their own production of EVs. You take that out, he's making maybe $4 billion a year going down, and the market cap was $1 trillion, right? So
Yeah.
just figure it out. It's 250 times earnings. The average car company sells for less than 10. So can he get there? Wall Street thinks so, but it doesn't make sense to me. And it makes a good story, right? Because people read that story in a big way because it was so contrarian. Not completely, because there are a lot of skeptics on Wall Street, but people have gotten killed shorting the stock. So there are much more pros than cons on
Yeah.
Wall Street.
The stocks frequently they deflate, but not always.
Thank you so much for speaking up, and you're writing all these stories all the time, great narrative. I'd be curious to know what sort of things you read or come back to time and time again. What do you derive?
I really
literary-
So she was asking what kind of articles that Shawn reads, you know what I mean?
And not
Not
just
that he writes,
articles,
right?
but any, you studied English in undergrad, so
Yeah,
I'm curious what you found out.
I read obviously all day news to pick up stories and to flesh out articles that I'm working on. But they're short, right? But I read books mainly, and I really recommend Bill Gates's book, Source Code. I thought of him as a very cold individual and kind of emotionless and hard. But the way he talks about his family and his early upbringing and his adventures with his Boy Scout troop and the things that were important to him growing up are fascinating. And it's very well written. I don't know how much help he got, but it's as well written.
Ghostwriter.
Was there a ghostwriter?
Probably. You don't
Well,
think he wrote it?
Such
All I can tell you,
skepticism, I can't believe
The
it.
what the published result is very readable, very moving in some ways, very intimate about his family. His mother is a real force of nature, kind of a Jackie Kennedy type in the 1960s. It's really a wonderful book.
I think we have one more question, then we're gonna wrap it up. Anybody?
Another one, Henry Kissinger on leadership, leaders. That's a great one. Charles de Gaulle, the chapter on Charles de Gaulle after living in France. Fabulous.
This guy is a Francophile, you can tell. Just breathing in Charles de Gaulle. Well, anybody have one last question? And then that'll be it.
Yes, so your writing is a balance of color and analytical, and I wonder if there was a point where that didn't fit together, where you had to force it earlier in your writing as you were kind of developing your style, and if there was a moment that clicked or a specific story where you said, okay, I think I have this now, or did it kind of come more organically?
I think when I first started, I was much more into the personalities than the business stuff. When I go back and look at some of the things that I wrote when I first got promoted to being a writer, maybe I overdid it in that way. But I did one was a good one, called The Fall of Dome Petroleum, which was really a clash of a very buttoned up guy who was very careful with money and a complete gunslinger who got them in a huge amount of debt, and this huge company in Calgary fell apart. I was able to talk about it in terms of their personalities. So at the clash of personalities, which was at the center of that collapse. But I think gradually I got more versatile and was able to write more analytical pieces or combinations that had both. Another one that had both was one called The Marriage from Hell, about Northwest Airlines and KLM, which was a complete disaster with two sides. For the very formal side from the Netherlands versus Gary Wilson and Al Checkey, two of the great financial engineers of all time, fighting the extremely formal. With Gary Wilson got arrested for smoking pot, which is the biggest thing in Holland, and he made a joke about it, which he didn't take too well. But anyway, so those are some of the early ones.